Hi, y'all. This nutrition section is a little abbreviated compared to the book. I'm going to highlight the most important parts, tie it into digestion and the breakdown of foods and how those foods are going to create energy. So, nutrients are going to be everything that we put into our body, right? Things that are good for us, hopefully, that are going to help us grow, maintain our bodies, repair anything that's getting old, used up. For example, skin, it replaces monthly. So we need to be sure and be eating the correct nutrients for all of our cells that are going to go through any sort of mitosis, or all of our cells that don't go through mitosis that need little molecular repairs. We need to be sure that we're eating properly. So the term macronutrients is the groups that you already know about: carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. Micronutrients are going to be vitamins and minerals. So we definitely need them, but they're in small amounts. Water, of course, is required, or else we'll die. So technically that's a nutrient too. Whenever you hear the term essential vitamins and minerals, those are things that what that means is our body doesn't make those things, because there's a whole lot of anabolism going on in our body from things that we have eaten. We're going to rearrange some things and make a new molecule like gluconeogenesis. We're going to use, if you don't have carbs, we're going to make glucose with parts from amino acids and parts from fats. But there's some things that we can't do that with. And so if that's the case, that means we must consume them. We have to eat these things. And so therefore they're essential nutrients. Here's the My Plate Food Guide. Notice vegetables and fruit take up half of the plate. Oh, look, grains. Carbs are good for us? What? A lot of your amino acids that you're going to take into your body come from your grains. So we really do need those carbs. By the way, vegetables do actually have carbs in them, and those are good carbs. But things like quinoa, that is an excellent grain that also has some protein in it, or brown rice, or any of the wild rice. It's still got a lot of the husk on it. So these are minimally processed grains that are loaded with amino acids that we need. So the first group, carbohydrates. Carbs are going to be starch, sugars, fiber such as cellulose. 50–60% of our calories should be from carbs. So like I just mentioned on the previous slide, actually you get some carbs from vegetables. Healthy carbs are unstripped carbs. So white rice is very stripped of all of its casing and everything. So brown rice is better for you. Wild rice is better for you. Quinoa, if you've ever had that, then you can tell that it actually has a little bit of fiber to it, but it also is loaded with protein as well. That's one of those quote-unquote superfoods. Our carbs are mostly from plants, except milk. Milk is not from a plant, obviously, but most of our carbs are going to be, wheat or vegetables or rice, potatoes, things like that. And then fiber, although fiber is not something that you can absorb into your bloodstream, it is very important for gut health and heart health. That should be listed on there too. Okay, so carbs broken down into the monomer of glucose is what that mitochondria is going to use to make ATP. And actually, there's some cells in our body, the nervous system and red blood cells, that can only use glucose for energy. So I'm telling you that, you know, if your body can use fats and proteins to go through gluconeogenesis, but we must have glucose in the neurons and in the red blood cells. So if you don't, you've got to help your body out. You need to have some glucose in your diet, or at least carbs that will break down into glucose. And you need to have a little bit of fat stores, right? If you take in too much glucose, it's going to get converted into glycogen or fat. The liver is going to decide what to do. It can only hold so much glycogen. But first, it's going to take the glucose that's excess and combine it, anabolize it, right? Anabolism is to build, and store that as glycogen. And the rest of it's going to get converted to fat. Notice in your lab book for the digestive enzyme lab, so the third lab that we do, the third week, your pancreatic amylase is going to break carbs down into maltose. That is a disaccharide. So maltose is glucose plus glucose. Then when we get into the small intestines, especially the duodenum, we're going to have some brush border enzymes that are going to finish everything out. So maltase, sucrase, and lactase are going to break lactose into, well, specifically lactase is going to break lactose into glucose plus galactose. Maltase is going to break maltose into glucose plus glucose. And then sucrase is going to break down sucrose to glucose plus fructose. So galactose, glucose, and fructose are monosaccharides. Pancreatic amylase breaks it down into a disaccharide. Fats should be about 30% of our calories, preferably unsaturated. And we're going to use those things. Like, remember that phospholipid bilayer? That's all. Phospholipids are lipids, right? And we need some fat to protect our body, to insulate our body. We need it for fuel. If you remember your bone marrow in the shaft of your bone marrow, not the red, but the yellow, that's mostly fat for fuel storage. Myelin sheath. So the myelin is made mostly of fat. Cholesterol is the base for a lot of the steroids in our body, the hormones in our body, our fat-soluble vitamins, cholesterol-based. So those are all lipids. And then lipids are actually the major fuel for skeletal muscle and hepatocytes. Proteins are going to be broken down into the monomer of amino acids. This is the guy that varies on your age and what's going on in your life. So, you know, if you are a pregnant woman, for example, you are building a baby inside your uterus. You need a lot of building blocks to build the baby. And proteins are massive. They're the majority of the molecules in your body. They're enzymes. Remember those little gateways that allow things in and out of the cell, the integral proteins. There you go. A lot of our hormones are amino acid based. Remember, some of them are amino acid based, and some of them are steroid based, which is a cholesterol base. But amino acid base, where those amino acids come from? The proteins that you ate. Connective tissues, your skin, actin, myosin, that's all proteins. So where do we get proteins from? We get it a lot from animals. You can get it from eggs, soybeans, legumes, nuts. You can get it from certain grains, like I already mentioned, quinoa. And some of these things we must eat because our body can't make it. And do you remember in AMP1 when we did protein synthesis? If you messed up an amino acid in that chain, in that genetic link that made that protein, you messed up something significant in the body potentially. In the lab book, what we did was we built the protein hemoglobin, or at least part of it. But one of the amino acids in the exercise got switched. And what we were demonstrating in the lab book on that one amino acid boo-boo, that one mistake made that person have sickle cell anemia. One amino acid's messed up. So that just shows you how important all the amino acids are. You must be sure and have a balanced diet so that you can create all the proteins in your body. And remember, you have so many. So what do we use the proteins that are all broken down to? Well, it depends on, again, what your body's doing. Are you pregnant? Are you a growing child? Well, then you're going to need more protein to build the tissues. So you're going to maintain a positive balance for homeostasis. If you are stressed and maybe not taking in enough food, maybe you're ill, so physically ill, or if you're not eating good proteins, if you're eating maybe some processed proteins or foods that seem like they're proteins, but they're also packed with a lot of fillers, you can actually put yourself into a negative balance, which is not healthy. Eventually, what will end up happening, if you don't have a good intake, your body is going to pluck it from some sort of tissue so that it can get what it needs. So the micronutrient vitamins, we have two categories we put them in. One kind we don't store, that's water soluble. You can take the whole bottle and you're gonna pee them out. You're not going to hold on to those guys. Water soluble, they're going to, especially the B's, C's, you must remember from the stomach, in order to absorb B12, you must be making intrinsic factor. So review that if you don't know what I'm talking about. Stomach cells, parietal cells make intrinsic factor. Otherwise, you're going to get pernicious anemia. Fat-soluble vitamins can be excessively consumed because you can actually store those, A, D, and E anyway, not K. These guys will be absorbed with lipids and stored somewhere in your body. This is listing, you're more likely to recognize the names than the numbers. I mean, yes, you know that there's a B1, B2, B3, but does thiamine sound familiar? Does riboflavin sound familiar? Does niacin sound familiar? So I went ahead and listed them all out, but I bolded B9 because folate is very, very important. And if we females are in the reproductive age, you should definitely make sure that even if you're not trying to get pregnant, to be sure that this is in your diet. Very important, because you can have a lot of embryonic development problems if you are in your early pregnancy and you're low on this. The baby could still be born, but the baby's going to be born with some birth defects possibly. So you want to always be sure and have enough folate, folic acid in your diet. So I listed some places that you can find that. Orange juice is a biggie, and actually the orange juice companies use that, or at least they used to, in their commercials and point out how important orange juice was. Spinach, beans, grains. So there you go. Keto diet, you're avoiding all those carbs and you think you want to have a baby? Stop it. I want you to notice that especially niacin and riboflavin are going to show up in the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle for production of ATP and the electron transport chain. So super, super important vitamins. Maybe you might see on the shelf B vitamins for sale, and the label will say something about for energy. Well, that's true, because you must have the niacin and riboflavin are kind of a backbone for some of the electron transporters that are going to give us ATP. Vitamins C, E, and A, and selenium, which is a mineral, are all antioxidants. What does that mean? Well, sometimes we'll have molecules that valence shell doesn't. Do you remember that? The octet rule? They don't have a complete valence shell, and so they can actually start to react with cells and cause damage to them. So those are called free radicals. So we want to neutralize those free radicals, because if we're not damaging our cells, if we're getting rid of free radicals, that essentially can be a potential anti-cancer. So what a simple way to make sure that you're balanced on your vitamins A, C, and E. We actually use a lot of our vitamins as coenzymes in the anabolism and catabolism in our body of our nutrients. So vitamins are essential for life, and a nice natural way to try and stay healthy. Minerals. Do you remember us talking about calcium? You have to have calcium to contract a muscle. You have to have calcium to fire a neuron. You have to have calcium to clot blood. Calcium and phosphorus are both, and magnesium actually, are important for keeping bones nice and hard. Another mineral, iron, that guy helps you carry oxygen. Iodine, we've already mentioned that guy. You can't make thyroid hormone without it. And of course, sodium and chloride, potassium, all these guys are going to be used as major electrolytes in our blood. So mineral-rich food, vegetables, 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 vegetables. Do you remember this definition from AMP1? Metabolism is actually the sum of anabolism plus catabolism. So anabolism is building things up, catabolism is breaking things down. So doesn't that make sense? You are going to eat something, it's going to be broken down into tiny little pieces. Why do you do that? Because you need those nutrients to build healthy tissues. So we're going to have 3 stages of these nutrients that you put in your body. There's going to be 3 stages to get to ATP. The first stage is just simplifying the food and getting it transported to where it needs to get, to your cells. Okay, so you're going to break down those proteins into amino acids. You're going to break down the carbs into simple sugars. You're going to break down the lipids into fatty acids. And then we're going to transport it all to the cells that need these nutrients to make ATP. So we're going to get to the cell, and in the cytoplasm, we can either have the synthesis of lipids, proteins, and glycogen, so build things up, or we're going to use that glucose molecule and break it down. Glycolysis, the breakdown of glucose molecule into pyruvic acid and a compound called acetyl-CoA. That's going to happen in the cytoplasm. The next step, as long as oxygen is present, so oxidative breakdown, the next step that pyruvic acid is going to enter into the mitochondria, and we're going to take it further. We're going to have Krebs cycle, and then we're going to have oxidative phosphorylation to make the majority of our ATP.
As this mountain biker heads up the trail, the breakfast he ate this morning is being burned to power his bike ride. His breathing rate increases as his leg muscles demand more oxygen to burn more fuel. Let's zoom down to where this fuel is burned, our cells. Here, the blood vessel on the left delivers fuel and oxygen to a single muscle cell. In cellular respiration, energy in fuel is converted to ATP, shown here as starbursts. Most ATP is made in the cell's mitochondria. ATP powers the work of the cell, such as contraction. Let's take a closer look at how ATP is produced from a molecule of glucose, our fuel. Only the carbon skeleton is shown to keep things simple. The first step is called glycolysis, and it takes place outside the mitochondria. To begin the process, some energy has to be invested. Next, the molecule is split in half. Now, the molecule NAD+, an electron carrier, picks up electrons and hydrogen atoms from the carbon molecule, becoming NADH. Keep track of the electron carriers. They play an important role by transporting electrons to reactions in the mitochondria. In the final steps of glycolysis, some ATP is produced, but not much. For every glucose molecule, only 2 net ATPs are produced outside the mitochondrion. However, glycolysis has produced pyruvic acid, which still has a lot of energy available. Let's follow this pyruvic acid molecule into a mitochondrion to see where most of the energy is extracted. As the molecule enters the mitochondrion, 1 carbon is removed, forming carbon dioxide as a byproduct. Electrons are stripped, forming NADH. Coenzyme A attaches to the 2-carbon fragment, forming acetyl-CoA. Coenzyme A is removed, and the remaining 2-carbon skeleton is attached to an existing 4-carbon molecule that serves as the starting point for the citric acid cycle. The new 6-carbon chain is partially broken down, releasing carbon dioxide. Several electrons are captured by electron carriers, and more carbon dioxide is released. The carbon dioxide that you exhale comes from the reactions of cellular respiration. 2 ATPs are produced by the citric acid cycle for each molecule of glucose. At this point, only a small number of ATPs have been produced. However, more energy is available in the electrons that are being transported by electron carriers. While the citric acid cycle starts another round, let's follow an electron carrier to the next step in the process. Electron carriers such as NADH deliver their electrons to an electron transport chain embedded in the inner membrane of the mitochondrion. The chain consists of a series of electron carriers, most of which are proteins that exist in large complexes. Electrons are transferred from one electron carrier to the next in the electron transport chain. Let's take a closer look at the path electrons take through the chain. As electrons move along each step of the chain, they give up a bit of energy. The oxygen you breathe pulls electrons from the transport chain, and water is formed as a byproduct. The energy released by electrons is used to pump hydrogen ions, the blue balls, across the inner membrane of the mitochondrion, creating an area of high hydrogen ion concentration. Hydrogen ions flow back across the membrane through a turbine. Much like water through a dam, the flow of hydrogen ions spins the turbine, which activates the production of ATP. These spinning turbines in your cells produce most of the ATP that is generated from the food you eat. The process you've just observed, cellular respiration, generates 10 million ATPs per second in just one cell. That ATP can power a biker up the trail, or it can power your brain cells as you learn challenging biology topics.
So maybe you've recognized this reaction that's written down here, right? C6H12O6 is glucose. Glucose plus oxygen, so one glucose molecule, when we oxidize it, oxidation of glucose, one glucose molecule is going to yield 6 waters, 6 carbon dioxides, and 32 to 38 ATPs, plus a little heat, right? So we're going to have some exchange reactions. So catabolism, anabolism, we're going to make some ATPs, and that's one glucose. So how does that happen? First, like I said in the previous slide, we're going to have glucose be broken down in the cytoplasm, that's called glycolysis, into pyruvic acid and acetyl-CoA. It uses 2 ATPs for that to happen, and it yields 4 ATPs. So the net total of ATPs that are made from glycolysis, from breaking down the glucose initially, is going to be 2, right? Then, as long as oxygen is present, we're going to take those pyruvic acids, move into the mitochondria, and we're going to do the next phase, which is the citric acid cycle, also known as the Krebs cycle. We're going to make 2 more ATPs. We're going to make some other things, but we're going to make 2 ATPs. So just doing the ATPs right now. So now we have 4 ATPs. The final amount of ATPs is going to happen at the next step, also at the mitochondrial level. It's really cool. Watch the video. Do your best to understand it. We're going to have the tossing around of electrons thanks to some of the other guys that came from the Krebs cycle and from glycolysis. They're electron transport carriers, and they're going to be carrying some of those electrons into step 3 so that we can make ATP. They're called coenzymes, and this is the riboflavin and niacin. This is where these guys they help create these electron transport carriers, this NAD and FAD. Okay, going back to step 1, glycolysis. This happens in the cytoplasm. We're going to break down a glucose molecule into 2 pyruvic acids and 2 NAD pluses. And this is going to yield 2 ATPs. So not very efficient. It used 2, it made 4, so the net yield is 2 ATPs. But one of the important little products that came out is that NADH, because he's going to help us out in the end with the electron transport chain. So this is what's going to happen. If there is oxygen present, that NADH is going to transfer the hydrogens in the electron transport chain to make some ATPs. And there's a video on that, right? The electron transport chain. So that's if oxygen is present. If oxygen is not present, then it's not going to go into the mitochondria. Mitochondria is all about oxygen. So if it doesn't, then what's going to happen is that NADH is going to give that hydrogen that it's carrying back to pyruvic acid, back to the other product of glycolysis. So if no oxygen is present, we're not going to go into the mitochondria and finish out the development of ATP. We're going to stop right there, and we're going to have a buildup of lactic acid. Maybe some of y'all have heard before that lactic acid creates the burn when you exercise, but it has to do with You exercised maybe just a tad too much, maybe you pushed it, or if you hurt really bad, you pushed it a lot because you exercised past the point of getting good oxygen intake. So you were into oxygen debt. You remember that? AP1, oxygen debt? You put yourself into oxygen debt, and so there's not enough oxygen to keep this process going. You build up lactic acid. You know, there's other places besides your skeletal muscle that you need oxygen, right? You got to keep everything alive. So we're going to give the oxygen to the brain so you can stay alive, and your heart so you can stay alive. The skeletal muscles will just pay for it. This is showing the Krebs cycle. You might have, if you had biochemistry, you probably had to regurgitate this. I tried and blacked out all the little names and everything just so you can see the pictures. But you can see here how in the cytosol we had glucose broken down into pyruvic acid, 2 pyruvates. And if oxygen was present, it migrated into the mitochondria. And we continued with the Krebs cycle. Notice what's coming off here, all these little things like this. Those are electron transport carriers. And they're going to move forward into the next step.
Most of the energy harvested from organic molecules during glycolysis and the Krebs cycle is stored in NADH. NADH and FADH2 molecules give up their high-energy electrons in the third phase of cellular respiration, electron transport and ATP synthase, where most of the cell's ATP fuel is produced. The electron transport chain is an array of molecules, mostly proteins, built into the inner membrane of the mitochondrion. NADH gives up its high-energy electrons to the first complex in the electron transport chain. The electrons move from one member of the chain to the next, giving up their energy as they are pulled from NADH toward oxygen. The energy given up by the flow of electrons is used to pump hydrogen ions from the mitochondrial matrix into the intermembrane space. Oxygen captures the electrons in the very last step in electron transport. The last complex adds a pair of electrons to an oxygen atom and 2 hydrogen ions, forming water. The electron transport chain has used the energy of moving electrons to pump hydrogen ions into the intermembrane space. This buildup of hydrogen ions, like water behind a dam, stores the potential energy that was originally in the bonds of glucose molecules. The backed-up hydrogen ions give up their energy when they diffuse through a special protein complex in the membrane called ATP synthase. As hydrogen ions flow down their concentration gradient, ATP synthase captures their energy to make ATP. Under normal conditions, almost all the ATP produced in the process of cellular respiration is manufactured by the energy that electron transport provides to ATP synthase, about 34 ATPs for every glucose consumed.
So this is showing essentially starting with one glucose molecule, all the steps that it goes through, assuming that there is oxygen present. The first step is glycolysis. We're going to break it down into 2 pyruvic acids. As long as there is oxygen available, it's going to move into Krebs cycle. And then because of the electron transport carriers, we're going to move on to the electron transport chain. From the glycolysis, the NADH can also come over in here straight into the mitochondria and go to the electron transport chain. So in a nutshell, glucose is going to be broken down, and we're going to use some NADH, FADH to carry the hydrogens and the electrons into the final stage where the majority of the ATP is made, into oxidative phosphorylation. So roughly 32 to 38 ATPs is made from one glucose molecule.